Welcome to the Sound of Economics. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of Bruegel, and today I'm delighted to host Simone Tagliapietra, a fellow at Bruegel, who has worked in the last quite some time actually on a book called Fundamentals of Global Energy Fundamentals, which has just been published by Cambridge University Press. It's a tour de force, a book that covers all the big issues for everyone interested in global energy economic questions. And so we want to discuss this book and then, of course, use the book also as an opportunity to discuss some of the pressing issues concerning climate policy and energy policy in the European Union. So welcome, Simone. Thanks for joining. And Simone, why don't you start walking our listeners through the key messages of your book?
Thank you, Guntram, and thank you all for listening. Global Energy Fundamentals is a book that wants to provide an overview about the energy world and the challenges related to climate change and energy access in developing countries. As we know very well, energy is a key prerequisite for modern life. Energy represents the lifeblood of modern societies, and we could simply not have our daily life without a proper access to energy. If you think about it from an historical perspective, every international order in modern history has been based on an energy resource. So we think about the British Empire and the role of coal in that during the 19th century. We think about the so-called American century and the role of oil. And now, the 21st century, many think that China will emerge as the global energy superpower due to the renewable energy and the mastering of these technologies. Now, I think that over the last 2-3 decades, the global significance of energy has become slowly more and more evident to all, also because of the challenge of climate change on the one hand and energy access on the other. Shortly on climate change, there is no way to tackle climate change without completely reshaping the global energy system. Why? Because the global energy system represents almost 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore it is the combustion of oil, gas, and coal which are the real responsibles of climate change. And if you look at the global energy mix today, the astonishing number we need to, I think, talk about is the fact that 80% of the global energy mix today remains based on fossil fuels. While on the other end, wind and solar only make up 2% of the global energy mix. So this is the reality we have today.
So Simone, let's focus a little bit on this point. I mean, you started off by talking a bit about the history, and of course, pre-fossil fuel, most of the energy was essentially energy of humans and animals, and a little bit of wind energy that we had in some Dutch windmills, I guess, and in some Italian windmills, I guess. But now we really entered the fossil fuel age sometime in the 19th century. We've been running for more than 200 years basically on fossil fuel, and basically, if I understand you correctly, we are still running on fossil fuels globally. Totally on fossil fuels. Are there differences across countries? Are there some countries where you would say we are already starting to really enter the next phase?
Well, of course, the energy mixes of countries are profoundly different for mainly two reasons: resource availability and energy policy. So a country tends to make use of the energy resource it has at its disposal. So, for example, if you look at the energy mix of a country, let's say like Brazil, you will see that hydropower plays a very important role. Why? Simply because there are vast availabilities of that kind of resource. Vice versa, if you look to, for example, at China, you will see that 60% of the energy mix of China is based on coal. Why? Because China has a wide availability of coal resources, and therefore it tends to make use of them. Now, this is the natural endowment dimension of the energy choice of a country. But then, on top of this, there is energy policy. And in my view, energy policy can be really designed as a triangle. Energy policy is a triangle in which you have the cost competitiveness dimension, the energy security dimension, and the sustainability dimension. Now, the point is that over the last, I would say, 2 decades, but really over the last years in reality, the sustainability part of the triangle has become more and more important. And therefore, countries that have availability, for example, of coal or gas or oil, are starting to say, we don't want to make use of them anymore because we give a value to the sustainability part and we want to get rid of the emissions these resources generate. And this is also allowed by technology cost, which, as we can discuss, in the case of renewables, are profoundly and quickly going down.
So let's indeed discuss a little bit the technology aspect to it. I mean, as you say, energy policy matters, but what also matters is really the price of alternatives. And so far, I would assume that the strong reliance on fossil fuels is still a reflection of the fact that fossil fuels are still cheaper in most applications than renewable energies. I mean, I drive a fossil fuel car because the electric car is just still at least 50% more expensive. I run China runs coal-fired power plants because they are cheaper than wind parks or solar parks. So can you tell us a little bit how quickly you see technological change in that space? I mean, there was a lot of technological progress, but have we come to the end of that progress, or in terms of forecasting, do you see that in the next 10 years, technology will actually make it a completely viable alternative to switch in our energy mix?
Well, as a matter of fact, over the last 10 years, the cost of a solar panel has decreased by 90%. At the same time, the cost of generating electricity with wind has decreased by 70%. So the speed of the decreasing cost of these renewable energy sources is impressive and keeps going on and on each single year. So over the next years, these forms of energy will be even more competitive than today. What I want to say is that already today, these forms of energy are competitive, for example, vis-a-vis coal-fired power generation rather than even gas-fired power generation in different circumstances. Now, what would be the key to really make these sustainable forms of energy, even more competitive vis-a-vis fossil fuels? Well, that will be to price in the negative externalities, as we say in economics, right? There is a problem with the burning of fossil fuel. The burning fossil fuels generate negative externalities, which are not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also local pollutants. These local pollutants have a cost for countries because, for example, they entail costs in terms of healthcare systems that need to take care of people that have diseases associated to these pollutants. What is the problem? The problem is that we don't price this pollution properly in the world. That's the problem of carbon pricing. If you look at the situation of carbon pricing in the world today, only 20% of global emissions are currently priced, but to a level which is below $10 on average per ton of CO2, which is far less than what is needed to provide a significant investment signal to the people in the industry that they need to shift away from these polluting forms of energy. So carbon price is a formidable tool policymakers have at their disposal to contribute to this shift from fossil fuels to renewables, which will happen in any case, simply because the renewables are becoming more and more viable in commercial terms.
Yeah, I mean, look, on the carbon pricing, let me play a bit the devil's advocate. I mean, we've been knowing and talking about the need to tax carbon CO2 emissions for a long time, and we've made very little progress. And why have we made very little progress? Well, because basically it is a cost on industry, it's a cost on households. It's unpleasant to impose that kind of a tax on the production process, and that's why basically we haven't done it. We have not, been able to set a carbon price at a level, a tax that at a level that would dramatically change behavior. So my I guess my best bet is still on technology. I mean, as the saying goes, the Stone Age didn't end because of lack of stone. The fossil age won't end because of a lack of fossil fuel. It will end because a new technology has become available, just as the Stone Age ended because a new technology became available, which is essentially metal. So let's talk a bit more about the technology aspect, because I really think it's quite fundamental. Because you say it is already cheaper, and that is true. The marginal cost of electricity and the marginal cost of wind energy. So when the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining, it's actually cheaper to consume electricity. But what about the transport sector? I mean, there we have batteries. You need to invest into still quite expensive batteries and electric cars. I mean, the fixed costs are still quite a bit more expensive. So there's many sectors where, and I'm not even talking about the airline industry, where electrification seems to be impossible. So how quick is really the progress? And because if it was really cheaper, I mean, why wouldn't we all drive already electric cars? Mm-hmm. I mean, we are not doing that at this stage.
Yeah, all these are interesting points indeed. Let me start with tackling the one concerning the power sector, because it's very important. There is a legitimate point that one can make, which is the following. I mean, solar panels and wind turbines can be cheaper and cheaper, but how do we deal with the variability of this electricity supply? We know we cannot follow the sunshine or the wind for our electricity needs in our offices, in our homes. We need energy when we need it, right? So we need to match the variability of renewable power generation together with our needs. Now, this is the integration challenge of renewables, which is, in my view, the most important challenge. We need to cope with this. What is the problem? The problem is that we still don't have today the technologies to store electricity in a significant manner. Yes, we have pumping hydro at the global level, which is the most utilized way today to store electricity, but can only be applied in certain geographies, for example, in the Alps. Batteries are technologies that will have to really follow the fate of solar panels and wind turbines of the last 10 years, so becoming more and more performant and more cheap quickly, in order to allow this integration to happen. There are also other ways to cope with this problem. One, for example, is green hydrogen. And that's why everybody now is crazy looking at green hydrogen and how to become the leader in this technology. Why? Because hydrogen is a vector which can be used to store and transport electricity, which is generated with wind and solar. So this is the point concerning the power system. We need to cope with the variability of solar and wind, and we need to invest in anything that can provide this flexibility to the system, spanning from hydrogen to batteries, from demand side management measures to, for example, smart grids. Now, there is then the point of the transportation sector, because as you rightly say, energy, or let's say power generation, is one emitting sector. There are others, as we know, even more important today in Europe, for example, which is transport. How do we decarbonize transport? But for the decarbonization of transport, we have basically two options. Either we get people out of their cars by, developing even more seriously public transportation rather than other forms of mobility, notably in cities, such as cycling and walking itself, or we provide them clean vehicles. What we are seeing today is a race for electric cars, which might well follow the same trajectory of, let's say, solar panels. So electric cars, every year we see new models coming up, which are cheaper than the year before and are more performant. What is the key for the success of electric cars is to develop proper batteries. The battery is the core of the electric vehicle, is the most valuable part of the electric car, and this is the most important, because you don't buy an electric car if you don't know that there is a certain driving range which is guaranteed, that you can safely drive without remaining without power in the middle of the road, and therefore that's key to allow citizens to purchase these vehicles. Of course, the state need to intervene by pushing innovation on the one hand, and I think that what Europe is doing on batteries by creating this battery alliance that has been there now for 2 years almost, and is trying to create a supply chain in Europe about batteries that are innovative. It's very important. The other thing is to subsidize the purchase of this vehicle, which is good at the initial phase of the development because it creates a market. And here I would like to mention that the EU has played a very important role in the creation of a global market of solar panels and wind turbines. The EU, by letting all of us, European citizens, pay the feed-in tariffs in our electricity bills, we have, as a matter of fact, subsidized a sort of global public good, which was the innovation on renewables. And thanks to Europe and to the market that was created in Europe with the feed-in tariff system, the Chinese could start manufacturing at scale solar panels, or the Danish and the Germans and others wind turbines. So this is a little bit the dynamic, and that can also be followed in transportation.
Let's talk a little bit about, and then I want to come at the end, perhaps to the remaining chapters of the book. But let's, before we do that, let me push you a little bit on sort of the global climate targets. I mean, globally, I think the United Nations climate panels and others are basically saying it's going to be extremely difficult to reach the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius unless we decarbonize really very, very quickly, meaning by 2050 we have to come to basically zero net emissions globally. The EU is itself trying to be very ambitious. The target that is announced is 55% carbon emission reduction by 2030, and essentially carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, I have to say I have my doubts on, I mean, everything that you say I think is very plausible, but the doubts I have is really about the speed. So 2030 targets, I have doubts on that. But more importantly, I have doubts also about the net zero. I mean, how can we achieve net zero by 2050? I mean, I can see a 70% reduction. I can see perhaps an 80% reduction. But most of these models that are used by the United Nations and other institutions talk about carbon capture technology. So for airlines, for example, since we can't really electrify it, we need to find a way of offsetting emissions by having carbon capture technology. And my understanding is the technological progress on carbon capture technology is actually quite limited. So can we really make the 100%? I mean, I believe that, yes, we can do the 70 or perhaps even 80%, but the 100%, is it even achievable?
Okay, that's becoming an interesting discussion. So I think the point is the following, that you're right that the new target that the EU will adopt by 2030, so the 55% target is ambitious, but we should not underestimate the power of these targets. I mean, if you recall, back in 2009, when the first 2020 framework was adopted for energy and climate, people were making fun at Europe all the time about this wishful thinking on renewables and so on. At the end of the day, it worked. with a lot of problems, of course. But Europe is at the front of global climate action and is one of the most dynamic markets on this. So I will really not underestimate these, because these targets are very important to provide to the industry a signal about where we are heading to. And the private sector really follows this, because nobody wants to find itself at a certain point to be out of the market because they didn't get the change. So this is one point. I think technology cost will keep going down from solar panels to batteries, and that will really be the major factor driving decarbonization. I think behavioral change will be important. If you look at the modeling, for example, of the European Commission about the 2050 targets, should we have a significant deal of behavioral change, which means that, for example, smart working, that it has become part of our life for other reasons now, but if part of this will remain in the future, that is a way, for example, to limit the transportation need. Same goes for, also think about the generational change in the view of car ownership. Maybe Guntram, your generation still was proud about owning a car, or at least the generation of our parents. But currently, if I look at the people of 30 years old and so on, I don't say that they are ashamed of owning a car, but certainly there is no more that drive of owning a car being a social sort of target. Now it is different, because it's not cool anymore, as simple as that. So this change is very important and can really lessen the cost of the transition. So I think that there is a mix of technology, of policy, and also behavior, so the action of each of us, that can really make a difference and really make the targets, even for 2030, viable. Now, on the longer term, so how do we get to climate neutrality? If you look at all the modeling done also by the United Nations, of course, climate neutrality by 2050 entails the need for carbon capture and sequestration, if not even for geoengineering technologies. Now, let me stay on carbon capture and sequestration, since you mentioned that. I think that this is a technology which is not clearly commercially viable today. I mean, there are pilot projects around, but this is not viable. And that's why, for example, in the EU, under the Innovation Fund, the EU is subsidizing carbon capture and sequestration projects, or wants to, because it is considered as an important element to contribute to the EU decarbonization pathway. Now, what makes me optimistic about the development of this technology is the fact that we have companies around, notably oil and gas companies, that without these technologies will have problem to remain alive in the new world. So for them, investing in this technology is an insurance policy. Like it is important for them, for example, to invest in biofuels, which is one of the potential ways to decarbonize, first of all, aviation. So I would really trust innovation on many different aspects, because if there is one thing about global decarbonization, is that there is no silver bullet. Anything that can contribute to the decarbonization pathway should be more than welcome. So if in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, carbon capture and sequestration becomes a viable, commercially viable technology, that will inevitably play a very important role. And I think that recently also the International Energy Agency has made that point very clearly. Same goes for biofuels that today are not developed properly. So there is a long way to go for them to become part of the solution, but we never know. I mean, this is the realm of innovation. So it is difficult to predict where we go. What is considered generally is that electrification will be the key for decarbonization. So if there is one bet that I would say almost everybody today make on decarbonization, is that the future will be electric. Right. And this will really not only concern the power generation sector and related, but also transportation, so the future of electric cars, but also of other sectors such as industry and buildings.
So Simone, we are coming to an end, but we haven't talked much about a special focus in your book, which is a very poor continent, south of Europe, namely Africa, which is of course a continent that hasn't industrialized in large parts, and therefore emits actually not much. Is among the low emitters. But certainly, if it wants to develop, needs massive access to energy. And so perhaps you can give us a bit of your view that you lay down in the book about how you see the electrification of Africa. What are the key policy choices that Africa has to make, and to what extent that is actually relevant for the EU and perhaps also an opportunity for the EU?
Yes, thank you, Guntram. This is indeed a chapter that is very close to my heart because I think that energy access represents perhaps one of the most fundamental challenges of our time, really in terms of socio-economic development. Today in the world, we have 840 million people across the world without access to electricity. We have 2.9 billion people that continue to lack access to clean cooking facilities. This means that every year in the world, we have around 4 million people that die prematurely due to the diseases associated to indoor air pollution. They cook inside of the house and they inhalate, and this creates, as we know, a lot of different kinds of diseases that lead to the premature deaths of 4 million people every year. So this is a major challenge of our time, and that's why the achievement of universal energy access is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, the number 7, and therefore is recognized to be extremely important. Now, Africa, I would say, is the hotspot of this problem globally. Africa is, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, which therefore doesn't consider North Africa, which is a different story, and also South Africa, which is a different country. But if we look at the subcontinent, excluding South Africa, the electrification rate is only 40%, and the clean cooking rate is only 12%. So it's really, really, really serious, the situation. If we look at the per capita consumption of electricity in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a graph in the book which is one of the most shocking in my view, which is the fact that the average person in certain African countries consume 10 times less electricity compared to our fridge in our kitchen. Only the fridge, nothing else. Only the fridge consumes 10 times more electricity than the average person, for example, in Ethiopia. So that tells you the situation. And without a solid access to electricity, there cannot be industrial development, there cannot be, economic growth. So this is a major problem. 2 are the solutions. One, as always, technology. And I think that renewables will play and are playing a key role to electrify particularly the rural areas that do not get access to the big electricity grid.
So solar panels on the roof.
Solar panels, exactly. And, also the creation of rural energy communities, small-scale hydropower, also wind, in a way, can provide a contribution, but notably solar, it's the important technology here, of course. And this can provide a very important contribution, and that's why several countries, as far as rural electrification is concerned, they are focusing on it. The second element is international cooperation. International cooperation, because there is a big deal of need of support, international support to develop, to implement these technologies. We know that often the framework conditions are not ideal for private investors. So there is really the case for multilateral financial institutions and also donors and like EU, which is the bigger one in the world, as we know, in terms of development assistance, to come in a very coherent manner and say to, for example, the country that is subject to this, look, try to put in place a sound policy framework, a sound regulatory framework that allows international private investments into solar energy in your country. If you do that, and that's for the good of your people, we cooperate. We provide the blended finance tools that are important to mitigate part of the country risks and the commercial risks associated to these investments so that we can unleash private investments in Africa. This is, in my view, the cocktail that is required to further develop electrification. And this is important because Africa, as we know very well, has a very young and growing population. And therefore, the current electrification efforts are being outpaced by the demographics. So we need to substantially scale up the efforts. And the international community has an important role to play. Also because this is a commitment assumed by developed countries under the Paris Agreement to provide climate finance to the poorer among the countries in the world in order to allow them to also have a sustainable energy development, which in certain cases might really lead to leapfrog the fossil fuel technologies we had directly to renewables. So that's something that can actually put certain countries really at the forefront of the technology, and that's very important because it can reach the rural areas in which most of these population without electricity today unfortunately remains.
Hey, Simone, I think we could, of course, go on for quite some time, but then people, I think, wouldn't need to read your book anymore. So I think the book covers, of course, not just what we discussed, but many other issues. A much deeper dive into the various technologies, also deeper dive into policies that are in place in the various countries to manage this energy transition. So I think we really covered a lot of ground in this 30 minutes. Let me thank you, Simone, for the great discussion.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I think the book is available at Cambridge University Press, and it's certainly an interesting read. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.